So today, guys, we're going to talk about LCA, but in particular, LCA in Ireland versus LCA in Denmark. And the reason for that is obviously KOSMOS are based in Ireland and in Denmark, and we have experience in both locations, and we can see the contrast between both locations. As always, we have our subcategories to our conversation today, and the first one is Denmark's sustainability journey over the last number of years. We're going to discuss that, and our colleague here, Simon, is going to get into that a little bit. And then where is Ireland in comparison to Denmark today? Where are Ireland in relation to their LCA journey and what's happening there? Colleague Archie is going to help us with that one. And then what are the elements of LCA? We need to become quite clear about LCA and what that means. And I think Roger will discuss that a little bit later. And more importantly, then kind of what do developers, asset owners and clients, where do they begin? What do they do? We're going to discuss the beginning of their journey and what's of interest and key to be looking out for when beginning this particular journey. And today is a two-part series. So the first part we'll cover our first 3 points, and then I think we'll break it into the second session, which is where do developers and asset owners and clients begin? Because it's a super interesting topic, and I know that question is asked so many times and in the heads of so many people. We're doing some of this remote today. We have myself, of course, as you know, and we have Simon. He is our sustainability specialist here in Denmark within KOSMOS. And everybody will introduce themselves in a minute, but we have Archie sitting in Dublin, sustainability specialist in our Irish office. And then we have superhuman Roger in Lowland in Denmark. And Roger is our carbon quantity surveyor. That's when the carbon QS, that's what it's coined as on LinkedIn, hashtag carbon QS, hashtag Roger superhuman. But Simon, maybe you can give a bit of an introduction to yourself, you know, your background, what you're doing at the moment and your hopes for the future, if you have any.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, as you said, I'm working as a sustainability engineer for KOSMOS. I've done it for the past 6 months or so. Prior to that, I worked for a developer. Also with sustainability. I've had a focus on sustainability in the building industry for the past 5 years during my studies and afterwards as a professional.
And your hopes for the future, you know, what do you want out of this sustainability bæredygtig hill journey in Denmark?
Yeah, I hope we can change the industry to not focus only on the cost, but also on the emissions in the industry.
And as you can imagine, that's a great conversation topic around the lunch table in our office, because we have a bunch of cost managers that focus on cost, and Simon is thrown in there in the middle of them saying, forget about cost, concentrate on carbon and sustainability. But over to you, Archie, sitting in Dublin there. Give us a little bit of an introduction to yourself, your past, your present and your future.
Yeah, I've been on quite a journey. So I started in architecture and moved to planning. But I've always had an interest in environmental issues and sustainability. And, I spent a few years working in compliance where the energy regulations became some of the most stringent and some of the most difficult to interpret and understand, with regulations like NZEP kicking in over the last few years. But for the last year, I've seen a real seismic shift in how people consider the sustainability of their buildings, where, the EPC energy rating and the green badge in terms of BREEAM and LEED are no longer really the indicator of sustainability. There's now a movement to look at, well, what's the carbon footprint of the building, its operations, its upstream supply chain, and even its embodied energy. And there's a growing understanding of this whole new discipline. But what makes it quite complex is that a lot of this has been driven by the financial industry, and they have a completely different lens for looking at sustainability. It used to be CSR, and, it didn't really matter that much. But over the last, particularly the last 6 months, we've seen the financial industry really come to the table and ask those difficult questions around, well, where are you going on your roadmap to track Paris-aligned climate goals? And that can be quite difficult to answer. The one thing that kind of brought me into the realm of the quantity surveyors is this is all about numbers.
What the hell are you doing with KOSMOS? You know, what's an architect doing in the middle of quantity surveyors? Aren't we arch enemies? No,
I am. I've gone to the dark side. Yeah. In order to have world peace, we have to first make we have to be able to work together. So look, we'll figure it out.
That's it. Yeah. Big sticks and a couple of beers on a Friday evening. We'll sort it all out. But Roger, over to you, son. Everybody knows who you are. You don't have your glasses on today, and everybody's going to be totally disappointed with that. So if they're beside you, I'd say stick them on so everybody knows who you really are. You know.
I might put them back on because I'm having difficulty looking at the screen right now. But I might start off with a softer one. I might start with yellow today. I am Roger. I am the equivalent of the Swiss Army knife, I suppose, who's involved in lots of different new branching and expanding things in the world of quantity surveying, if you like. So my interests are quite varied, and this is one of those areas that we've been branching out into that's been of increasing sort of interest, not just in the general side of things, but really in the detail. There's something that just is kind of fascinating and very interesting about the detail about these things, about being really down in the trenches, trying to do not just these calculations, but trying to respond to some of the broader questions that clients either bring up directly or indirectly, or even spotting the potential of what you can do or what you can provide coming out of the information and the type of studies that we're doing. So it's not just maybe if some people looks at LCA, or I kind of see them as starting points. So I'm quite interested and excited about all the stuff that branches off beyond that.
I guess we better get back to our topic of today rather than just talking about ourselves. So I don't want people to get bored or anything, you know. But we're going to look at LCA Ireland versus LCA Denmark for our Irish listeners, and it's not just for our Irish listeners. The reason we've picked Ireland, well, we're based there at KOSMOS. We have our office in Limerick, but our head office is in Copenhagen. So we have two hats on at any time. Really, it's our Irish hat and our Danish hat. And so it's LCA Ireland versus LCA Denmark. And we're going to look at some subtopics here relating to Denmark's sustainability journey, just to hear about what Denmark have been doing over the last number of years in relation to sustainability. And then where Ireland sits in comparison, not just Ireland, it could be any country really, because we would consider Denmark to be the leaders when it comes to sustainability and implementation of legislation to drive more sustainable construction. And what are the elements of LCA? You know, we talked a lot about before as well, Roger, me and you had a conversation about sustainability as a whole. It's so big, so massive, but we want to get down to the nuts and bolts of LCA. And then to close off that, we're going to look at and chat about where do asset owners, developers, clients, where do they start when it comes to LCA? Where does their journey begin? Because again, sustainability is a very big topic, a very large word, and it has multiple of layers and processes associated with it. But let's jump into the first topic. So Denmark's sustainability journey. I'll throw it on the table, and maybe Simon, you have kind of the most knowledge. You've been involved in it for the last 5 years, plus your education before that for a number of years. So, kind of, where did Denmark start with their sustainability ideals or journey?
I guess that most that work in the building industry knows that the CO2 emissions doesn't only come from the operations.
Yeah.
And that has been the approach for a very long time.
Yeah.
Now we're also looking at the embodied carbon. So we're taking this new approach, which is the LCA, life cycle assessment. It has been under development for the last 10 years or so. I think the first LCAs on building is 10 years ago, but the methodology has improved over the years.
Yeah.
And then for the first time in 2023, we got the new requirements for the building regulatory, BR 18, where it was required to deliver LCA on every building. And if the building is above 1,000 square meter, there's also a limit of 12 kilo CO2 equivalents per square meter per year.
And I think it's interesting when we talk about Denmark's journey, because Denmark has a very green electrical grid. Wind energy and solar are quite large suppliers of energy within the Danish environment, and I think that's why Denmark has moved. It has been the first mover towards looking more in depth at embodied carbon, because the process is now in place for squeezing as much value out of operational carbon by reducing or increasing the green within the grid. Now we look at the buildings themselves and design and see if we can improve them from an operational perspective also. But then what's remaining? It's that embodied aspect that's really remaining.
I think you have improved the, as you say, the operational energy. So it was like, what is the next step? Okay, we look at what is the emissions in the whole life cycle of a building. Okay, we can look at the products and we can look at what happened to the building end of life and what is the emissions in these phases.
And what I think is interesting, and guys, you can jump in online. I know, Archie, you have been looking at Denmark for quite some time, and in relation to what they're doing and how we can apply that to in particular to Ireland and Ireland's journey, and we'll talk a bit about that in a minute. But I think in some respects, Denmark is moving quite ahead in relation to LCA. If we dig under or look under the hood or dig a little deeper, it is interesting to see the approach in terms of the accuracy of LCA calculations. And what I mean by that is, like, there's a system in Denmark called LCA book. All buildings now all LCAs calculated using LCA book in Denmark.
Not all, but they kind of a standard to the requirements. If you use LCA book, you're sure that you will meet all the requirements for the building regulations. So I would say that 80 or 90% of all the LCAs is done
using LCA book. And LCA book, for our listeners out there, that was an open source platform developed by Aalborg University in collaboration with other organizations in order to set the standard baseline for how LCA is calculated in Denmark. And I think that's very key. I know, Archie, within Ireland, there's a bit of a challenge at the moment in understanding that baseline, the coefficients that you use for LCA. We'll get into a little bit more detail. But Archie, from your experience and knowledge looking at the Danish industry, what is your thoughts on its development over the last number of years?
Well, I suppose there's a tendency in Ireland to look at Denmark as kind of a leader in terms of sustainable design and construction. I mean, if you look at the Danish worked example of urbanism, lots of people see that as a good template for the future of city planning and transport in Ireland, and the same with the cycling infrastructure. And so it's only natural then to look at Denmark's example in terms of how they're decarbonising their built environment and their buildings. When you look at the Danish journey, you can see that they've already, people make reference to the fact that they have mandatory building regulations for embodied carbon. They have set targets that you have to have 12 kilograms of CO2 per metre squared as a benchmark. And they say, well, that's where we want to go in Ireland. So it is a good idea to kind of follow that journey, that trajectory, take the learnings from them. But when you break it down, it's actually quite interesting because, it didn't happen overnight. It was an 8-year journey. And their step one was simply to have guidelines that everyone could be consistent, everyone could speak the same language. The second thing they did was to do a toolkit, and the toolkit was all about ensuring that the way that you draw a red line around what you're going to count is consistent with what everybody else is doing. So let's say I'm doing a school and the consultant down the road is doing a school. We're not going to have widely diverging figures. So in Ireland, the Irish Green Building Council is doing that. Stephen Barrett on the Indicate project has a group of about 20 consultants that are providing that data. In Denmark, what they also did is through that tool, they started to get feedback and they started to understand where the data gaps were. So accuracy and consistency were important. So in a way, yes, it's good to have benchmarks. It's good to have targets, and there's good targets in London and there's good targets in Denmark. But before you get to that point, what's important is that you have consistency, because, you hear a lot from people who've actually commissioned LCAs that it's a bit of a Wild West, that the numbers come back and there's a lot of uncertainty built in. And, at design stage, it is acceptable to get a very high-level LCA with assumptions. But what we've learned from Denmark is you don't go to contract with that. You don't go to tender with that. Before you go to tender, you must test it against the market. And what I was really interested in from your example, from working on large projects in Denmark, was just the level of detail you might go to in terms of certain materials. So in terms of, say, steelwork, you can't just take a national average for steel if you're going to contract. You have to actually test it against the market and say, well, where is your steel coming from? Is it an electric arc furnace, or is it being imported from Asia? What's the difference between, assumptions and actually real products, real data sheets, real steel foundries? I suppose the risk is that a contractor will price up a project based on assumptions and then find, when it gets into technical submittals, that they can't deliver that. So one of the key learnings in Ireland isn't really about what target to use, but it's about where you really have to get into specific data. And in order to do that, you can't just generalize, put in a descriptive kind of specification for a product. You have to start engaging with the supply chain. And that's, I think, for many people is what becomes challenging and difficult about decarbonising their buildings.
We're getting into the weeds now, though, of LCA, and let's just bring it back again, because we'll get into those weeds later. But I think one of the important messages from the learnings from Denmark is that in Denmark it has been an 8 to 10 year process. Other countries are starting off now looking to be able to get LCA calculations at the same quality level that and same structure that Denmark currently have. But that's been an 8 year journey, and we need to be realistic in countries as well. And if we jump to point 2, and Archie, you're kind of leading into this, where is Ireland in comparison to Denmark? My understanding is we're just starting our journey. So we're Denmark 2015 on an LCA journey. Rather than, as you mentioned, jumping feet first into trying to get calculations in the granularity by bringing everything in, we need to really look at what is the roadmap of evolution here, and what does that roadmap look like in terms of the information that the targets we're looking to achieve, and the information we need to do that. Low-hanging fruits is one thing, big volumetric, as you mentioned, steel a while ago. Why don't we just concentrate on that for the time being? And in a number of years, we'll bring in the other aspects of it. But I don't know, Roger, maybe you have an opinion on that. And should we be looking at everything right now, or do we just concentrate in order to understand our process? Should we just be concentrating on the low-hanging fruit element to start the ball rolling from an Irish perspective?
I think for Ireland, you're entering a process, and there's a number of things that you can learn from what's happened in Denmark to try and improve on things. And one thing that I would prefer to see is to soft start the process by saying you need an LCA for everything, but you start off with a relatively small scope. So that way people don't get too panicked. They can focus on the key points. And as long as those LCAs get submitted, what will then happen is you'll start to build up carbon profiles, a lot of them. Because if you go back to the benchmark that we're using in Denmark, I think it's one benchmark for all building types rather than, say, LATI that has split by several building types. And the study that was done at the university, I think it's based on 43 projects. So if you do this soft start, it allows people to build up comfort, build up familiarity. It builds up the database so you can get much more targeted and specific benchmarks for when you intend to apply the benchmark. Because what I'm kind of expecting to hit with Denmark is we talked about measures. So a soft measure is, let's just do it, it's your choice. A medium measure is something like, it's your choice, but there's a consequence. So it's like taxation. You don't have to, but I will tax you if you don't meet this level. And a hard measure is like what we have in Denmark now, where the legislation is, you have to hit this target or you just don't get your building permit. But it's a soft start with a very achievable target. But what I'm I'm a little bit worried about is that every 2 years that amount decreases. You're going to find that some building types find it easier and some find it harder because we're not split currently by building types. And yet the building types can be so very different in their profile if you consider, say, industrial frame buildings and warehouses compared to offices, schools and houses. And I'm particularly worried about what might happen, say, with refurbishment projects, because they're even more dynamic because you can have a minor refurbishment, a medium or a major one. And the carbon profiles for those could be quite substantially different from each other. And it's the older buildings that really are in need of the upgrading. But that one-size-fits-all benchmark has the risk that it pushes people away from looking at the older buildings that really do need upgrading and bring the greater benefit.
So is there challenges currently then under the Danish structure of that standard benchmark across the entire industry? Is there also a need in Denmark to alter that a little bit, or is that coming down the road, do you think?
I think the limits is set pretty high. So the average of the buildings built now is 25% less emitting than the limit is right now.
Yeah.
So I think right now is just like a soft entrance to the LCA, and it will just get tougher and tougher down the road.
So then, Archie, in Ireland, do we have a challenge then? Like, do we have time to have a soft entry 8-year process to build up our knowledge base, as Roger's suggesting, and as Simon has described Denmark going through, or do we need to quickly look at Denmark's 8-year history and try to squeeze out elements that are of a learning and a trial and error process so that we can do it in 3 years or 4 years?
I think this kind of area is, the targets are shifting very quickly. So, if you asked some developers a year ago, they would have said, oh, look, we're waiting to see what the industry is doing. We're trying to see, well, when do regulations kick in? When will it become mandatory? They're looking at their buildings and trying to find where they can improve their ESG KPIs to get better access to finance. So there seems to be a kind of a twin track approach, that you have certain projects that are really pushing the boat out, and they are, getting right into very granular detail, and they, are measuring themselves against best practice across Europe. You've other projects then that are, merely ticking a box. They might have a green badge and they might say, look, we want to pick up some credits for having energy performance declarations for 20 of our materials, and we want a 5% or a 10% improvement. And that's as far as we go. But, if you come back to this space in 6 months' time, you might find that, it has evolved quite substantially. But we do have to short circuit the 8-year kind of process of Denmark and see if we can learn from that. So, in the meantime, we have better softwares, and we have, worked examples that you can look at projects that use circular economy or that use materials that have a lower embodied carbon.
Is there a contrast then between Denmark's approach to Ireland's approach, where Denmark has been publicly led, government led, I would say. This is what we're looking at. This is what we're doing. Where in Ireland, it's currently privately led. You said some businesses are really going into in-depth analysis on LCA. Is that the private sector or is that the public sector, in your opinion, Archie, that are kind of taking the bull by the horns, if you like, for an expression, and leading the way?
What you are seeing is all of these drivers are converging, so that you have the regulatory drivers are coming in. Even in terms of planning, like if you're demolishing a building now, you have to have a justification for why you're demolishing that. And that's generally has to include, operational carbon versus embodied carbon. You've also then got from another angle, you've got the financial drivers. So you've got the cost of money that, you have classifications and rules now about if you're going to call your building a green building, it must conform with certain definitions in the EU taxonomy or the SFDR. And aligned with that, then you have the voluntary requirements, which is that organizations will have set their own kind of carbon commitments, and they want to reduce their impact on the environment, but also address the risk that they see coming down the tracks. So in terms of how we're transitioning to a low carbon environment, they need to get ahead of that. So if you look at a project that is on the drawing board now, that project is probably going to hit the market in 2027. 2027 will be a very different environment. So if you imagine 3 years ago, we all rushed into the office, we did all of our productive work in the office 5 days a week. That's completely changed now. And you have to be able to see that transition as well happening with, how we define our buildings. They must be sustainable to meet organizational goals and financial goals, but also we're seeing that the EU directives, they have a very short transitional period. And, we know that the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive will kick in when the BER is required, not when planning is submitted. So, you really have to be 4 years ahead now in terms of what's being designed now must be fit for purpose in 2027, 2028.
And I just want to go, just to be clear here, when we talk about where is Ireland in comparison to Denmark. So we don't have any current regulation around LCA right now in Ireland, right? There's no minimum standard requirement legislated at the moment. Is that correct?
No, there's no target, but we would often look to what they're doing in the UK. So we would look to LCA to see what best practice is, and we would look to RICS to see how you might, use a methodology to calculate carbon. So, we're kind of at step 2 of 5 on the Danish journey. Now, I suppose one of the risks for Ireland is that when we compare the carbon footprint of our buildings against Denmark and London, they really come up short, because you have to realise that, if you are building a low energy building, you're going to try and connect that to a decarbonising grid. The UK grid and the Danish grid are much further along that journey. So outside of the footprint of your building, there are other factors that have a huge impact on how you decarbonise your building, and the grid being the biggest one of those.
So that must be one of the bigger challenges then, from an Irish perspective. It's almost at the political level, right? How do we greenify our grid so that embodied becomes a much more focused, like Denmark have done over the last 20 years. And we are working towards a greener grid. Like we all know that Ireland is an island, and there's an Atlantic Ocean on our west coast with a savage wind and wave possibility, but we haven't really utilized that yet. But that has to be step 1, I would say, rather than us jumping into step 2. Or can we run both concurrently, greening our grid, looking at embodied carbon, and hitting the targets by the time we get as far as 2030, 2050?
Yeah, look, there's a certain hierarchy here. So there's a sequence of opportunities really to look at. And some of that has to do with scale. So, if you have a building, you can do certain measures that will get you, 20, 30% carbon footprint reduction. And some of those are as simple as behavioral use, setting appropriate set point temperatures, or even just measuring, getting accurate measurement of your tenant data. But the low-hanging fruit runs out at about a 20 or 30% improvement. And then you're starting to look at replacing equipment or, going for more energy efficient windows. And it starts to get quite disruptive. But I mean, that can be done in the medium term. But if you look at a glide path towards net zero, you might get 40% reduction, 50% reduction by 2030. But what happens after that? And after that, really, you're looking at a bigger scale. You're going from the building scale to the neighborhood scale. So you're saying, well, across the road, there's a data center that is looking to get rid of heat. They want cooler water coming back into their system. Is there a synergy there? Or looking at smart grids. So, if I have excess solar power, can I trade that?
That'll be a challenge for us in Ireland, and I'm going to generalize here an awful lot. But from a Danish perspective, Denmark really focus on and have been over. I think the city strategy for Copenhagen is somewhere in the region of almost 50 years old now. The finger, it's called. It's the palm that starts in the center of Copenhagen and diverts out by the different townships outside and in infrastructure and so on. Like, we don't have any of that for any of our cities in Ireland. So you're talking about a complete kind of mindset shift from our traditional private sector focus into a more government-led social impact focus in order for us to be able to greenify and become more sustainable as an industry for one, but also within our communities. Like, that's not small.
Absolutely. There's an architect, an urban planner, Tony Reddy, but he spoke about, where do, say, Copenhagen and Dublin, why are they so different? But he said it wasn't always that way. In the 18th century...
We weren't around then, though, Archie, just so people understand that we weren't alive in the 18th century. We might look old, but we're not that old, No, continue.
Well, I'm getting to the point, but even closer to that, like in the 1930s, we had Abercrombie's plan, which was similar. It had these, it had a tight urban core, but then with these dormitory towns on the fringe, surrounded with a greenbelt in between. But we have a very car-dependent society, and it's very difficult to unravel that. But our planning here, it's not so much forward planning as it is development control. It's a very adversarial relationship with the authorities. And I've noticed in Denmark, they do have a better partnership, that the city will put in the infrastructure for housing development to follow. They'll put in the rail lines. And that forward thinking isn't really here. But it has to be, if the EU action plans are headed on a net zero trajectory, that's, to 2050, that means that a lot of this stuff has to be in place before 2040. And really, that's not that far away. We can remember 2020, and that's a lot closer to us now than 2040 is.
But let's get back into, I think we've compared Ireland to Denmark in many ways there, but certainly when it comes around to its LCA journey, that we're on the first step of a long journey here in Ireland, but we should absolutely be looking to Denmark for their experience, knowledge, and try and learn from them to speed up. But let's just jump into, like, what are the elements of LCA? Really, what are the elements of LCA? It's not sustainability, yes, but it's only a part of sustainability. I believe there's a misunderstanding. I think when people say sustainability, they think carbon LCA, but that's actually not the reality.
Yeah, I totally agree. In the industry there talk about like a tunnel vision. So right now we're only measuring CO2 when we talk in sustainability. We're not talking about acidification or biodiversity or chemistry going into the fields when building, and where do the products come from. I just think it's a start. It's to get people getting into it without being afraid of how do we manage all of these parameters. So we're starting about this one parameter, which is kind of easy to understand. And then I'm pretty sure we will work further with all the other parameters.
I think an analogy we could use is the electric car, right? Everybody is jumping towards the electric car as the savior. But the fact is, if you look into the materials used in the lithium batteries, is so unsustainable because of the amount you need to excavate out of the ground in order to get enough raw material to make these.
You haven't seen all the impacts. How long does an electrical car run? So there's a lot of, but every time you try and approach things differently, you have to learn from the mistakes and the victories. What you say. So,
but Roger, when we talk about the elements of LCA, then like what does that mean? Life cycle assessment. We mentioned a little bit about embodied and operational carbon, but LCA, from our perspective, I guess, what are we talking about?
Well, it kind of, from the quantity surveyor's point of view, it kind of mirrors very closely to life cycle cost. So you've got these sections like A, which is A1 to A5, which is kind of like manufacturing and bringing the raw material, transporting it to site and building it into your building itself. Then you've got the B section, which is kind of the operational life of the building, but which also has the operational energy and operational water elements to it, which historically used to be the biggest part of the carbon calculation. But because the grid's getting consecutively greener and because all the focus was on energy efficiency, that diminishes and diminishes, and now all of a sudden embodied carbon appears to be this much bigger thing. Then you get to section C, which is kind of to do with the demolition and disposal at the end of the life, and then section D, which is kind of like your offsetting and your circular economy kind of elements, which are not very well represented in a lot of systems across the world. It's most people want to see the whole life calculation with section D separate, which is a bit of a contradiction because a lot of the things that you're kind of maybe looking for contradict themselves a little bit. Like with the design is, if you've got a building, you would rather, it's better from a carbon perspective and a cost perspective to refurbish a building instead of just knock it down and build a new one. And you want the building to last longer, which means you want materials with a much longer lifespan. But some of those ones with a much better lifespan or a much better circular economy to them are things like steel, which are currently seen to be a villain if you're only looking at, say, section A of the life cycle when it comes down to whole life carbon.
So it becomes important to understand the different categories there and how we should be calculating against those different categories, because as you mentioned, steel, concrete's another one. If we only look at the A's relating to steel and concrete, suddenly we have a very, very bad building. But if we look at the building life cycle over 200 years and concrete and steel are the only materials that last that long, again, that's not scientific base. I'm just throwing out a number there. Don't come back to me in the message going, yeah, Ross, what are you talking about 200 years? We'll hold those one back. But I think there's a point to be made there that it's important to understand what we're calculating against and what that means.
I just think that it doesn't always come down to how long a material can hold. It's also in a city, how does it develop? So sometimes a healthy building that could stood like 200 years from now is being teared down. Demolished. So you kind of have to look at the building and say, how long do we expect this to stand? And not only how can it.
Well, what is the lifespan of our buildings? Has that been defined within the regulations when we calculate the D, the E and the D sections there?
The lifespan of a building for LCA studies shifts from country to country. In some countries it's taken as 50, and in other countries they use 60. It seems to be the main two numbers that people are using. But like I say, it's a bit of a contradiction, because look how old most buildings are, and then look at the advice that's being thrown out at the same time: build for the future and renovate rather than knock down and start again.
It's funny to look at Copenhagen, because the 100 and 200 years old buildings are standing, and the buildings 50 years old from the 70s are getting demolished.
Yeah. So traditional materials seem to be the way forward here. We're sitting in a building that must be 150 years old today in Copenhagen, and you can guarantee this won't be demolished. No one will allow anybody to touch this. But what is the baseline in Denmark? Is it 50 years?
It's 50 years, yeah.
And Archie, have we set that baseline in Ireland yet? 50 years or 60 years when we talk about building life cycle?
Well, the methodologies we use would generally be 50 years.
Okay.
What's interesting though about, when you look at Denmark and compare that to Ireland, I suppose it's the process of design. So there's a bit of an art really to interpreting LCA. And when you interpret an LCA, you might find, well, look, the structure of this building is actually quite carbon intense. Why don't we change it to mass timber? And all of a sudden you have a building that was designed for steel or concrete, and they're just swapping those materials for timber. So the timber's having to, deal with spans or deal with structural systems that were designed for a different material. And what comes back then is a cost uplift that could be double the construction cost for the structure. Whereas in Denmark, there seems to be a more fundamental approach that at an early stage of the project, they're looking at the whole picture with regard to carbon. So the building is simplified. They make sure that, they use the appropriate spans. They make sure that the materials selected are selected for longevity, but also it's just a simple form, a compact form without too many cantilevers, simplified roofs and plant rooms. And the mechanical systems are better integrated. And in a way, the digital tools that they're using, particularly with building models, looking at the specific microclimate of the city, looking at overheating, looking at reducing the reliance on mechanical systems where possible, and looking at utilising low temperature district heating. I think a lot of those big levers, in terms of reducing carbon, have to be done at the project outset. And that is challenging in Ireland, where, you have to spend 2 years really getting past the planning and fire regulations, and it becomes very difficult to invest that time early on. So I think that will be the fundamental change, that decarbonisation is considered at the master planning stage and at the planning stage, rather than at developed design.
So we're talking about much more than just LCA here, embodied carbon and sustainability. We're talking about, in Ireland at least, there's going to be an industry shift here in order to be able to streamline. We talk a lot about MMC, modern methods of construction in Ireland, but this entire shift is almost moving a tanker ship, because we need to change the industry. Thanks very much for listening. There's a LinkedIn link below in the show notes. We would love to connect with you.
We hope you enjoyed it and have you with us in the next one. Thank you very much.